Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. How often have you heard the phrase, "It's about the journey, not the destination"? Well, today's guest is a great example of someone who started a daily creative practice and found that on that journey, it opened profound revelations about the connectedness of all things, the importance of place, and her own life. So I'm delighted to welcome Mary Jo Hoffman to the show. Mary Jo is a former aeronautical engineer turned artist and photographer. And for the past 12 years, she's been taking photographs every single day of natural objects found near her, such as leaves, flowers, seed pods, twigs, insects, or animals. Her new book, Still, The Art of Noticing, features 275 of the most stunning photographs that she has accumulated over thousands of consecutive days. Hello and welcome to the show, Mary Jo.
Hello, Bob. Thanks so much. I'm super excited to be here talking to you in the UK. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's thrilling to be on your show.
Oh, well, it's great to have you on. And I believe, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that you're in a sort of fairly countrified area with lots of nature and lakes and stuff around you. Is that right?
Well, I'm actually in a suburb of Minneapolis, and Minneapolis is about 2 million people. So it's a nice urban center. But I am in the suburbs, and I live on 3 wooded acres on a lake. In Minnesota, we have 10,000 lakes is the saying, but
wow.
a lot of people have opportunity to live on a lake, and I get that opportunity. And so I feel like I'm up north. I feel like I'm in the woods with my wooded acreage and lakeshore property, but I'm actually just in a second-tier suburb of Minneapolis.
Before we talk about Still, could you please just tell us a little bit about your life's journey and how you got into, first of all, the aeronautical engineering, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was born in 1964 and raised in the 1970s. In that wonderful era, I think about it often and how we could get back to that when kids got to run wild. Parents sent them out parents sent you out in the morning and didn't really care what you did or where you went as long as you were home by dinner. And we're so far from that these days. But that was my upbringing, running wild and at the edge of urban development. So it was all wide open fields, and spent all my time outdoors. And then I was, like I said, I was born in 1964. So I was the beneficiary of Title IX. Are you familiar with Title IX in the UK?
Personally, I'm not, Mary Jo. No.
Yeah, it was the legislation that required that for every boys' extracurricular activity in public schools, there had to be an equal opportunity for girls. And so it opened up all the sports for girls,
okay.
Right? So, and it's a big deal, and it changed things dramatically in the U.S. And that happened in right around 1980. And so I ended up playing soccer and went to college to play soccer. Suddenly it opened up, and I was not a very good soccer player, but I was because I was one of the first, right?
Yes.
And so I made all state and by being not very good. But anyway, when I got to college, it is interesting when one person can say one thing at the right time and it changes your path in life. And a physics teacher in my high school who I didn't have his class. I didn't know that he knew me, pulled me aside in the hall and he said, "What are you studying at college?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm going to play soccer." And he said, "Well, consider engineering because it's a hard school to get into and it's easy to transfer from there to somewhere else if you change your mind." He knew I was a good math and science student. And so I said, okay. And I just did what he said. Applied to the School of Engineering, got in, started doing my college coursework, and found out that I had a real aptitude for it. And so I stayed in engineering. I loved it. I loved the problem solving. I loved the mathematics, found it all like solving puzzles, getting paid to, solve puzzles all day long. And so ended up going to graduate school in aeronautics and astronautics out at Stanford. I picked aeronautics and astronautics not because it was a passion, but because it was the most math-based of all the engineering fields and required the most mathematics, and that was my strong suit. So then I got out of college and practiced that as a aerospace research scientist for 17 years. And I loved it. By the time I left, I was doing corporate research. I was working for a company called Honeywell. I'm sure you've heard of them.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
They do all of the avionics. So all of the electronics that go in almost every commercial airplane is mostly Honeywell, not entirely, but mostly Honeywell. Most satellites, it's guidance, navigation, and control is what we called it. My group did the autopilots and something called flight management system, which would be really, really close to Google Maps, Google Maps for airplanes. So anyway, that's what I did. I did that for 17 years. And by the time I left, I was head of an R&D lab with about 120 people. We had 17 people in Prague, Czech Republic. Most of us were in Minneapolis, where Honeywell was headquartered. Was opening an office in China, and I had 3 or 4 people down in Phoenix, Arizona, which is where the business unit was located. So it was a busy job. I had to travel all the time. Aerospace is international, as you can imagine. And so I was traveling a lot, and it was time. My husband and I decided to start having kids, and I'm a critical part of that half of that equation. So traveling was a problem. And at that time too, Honeywell got acquired, and I wasn't a big fan of the new company. And so between family planning and the acquisition of my beloved company, my beloved hometown company, I decided to leave corporate world.
I see. And did the company get involved in? Was it purely commercial airline stuff that you were involved with, or were you involved in space flight at all?
I did R&D. The way it worked in the United States. So I got out of college in the 80s.
Yeah.
It was the Cold War. Reagan was president. Immense amount of defense spending. Just an immense amount of defense spending. So when I got out of college, I had 8 job interviews and 8 job offers. I mean, crazy. I wasn't aware enough at age 23 to understand Cold War and defense spending. And all I knew is that, I got out of college and I could pick where I wanted to work.
Yes.
In research in the United States, most of it is funded by the U.S. government and most of it by the Department of Defense. So, and I was in research. And so I got into research and realized that a lot of it was defense spending. It wasn't super aligned with my values. I wasn't a super aware 25-year-old, but I knew in my gut it wasn't aligned with my values. So what I did is maneuvered my career. Honeywell did defense avionics, but they also did commercial.
Yeah.
And they do all the commercial airlines and, satellite navigation for telecom and stuff like that. So I maneuvered my career within the corporation so that I was doing almost exclusively commercial, so it would align better with my values. But yeah, we did the 90%, 80% of the funding in the corporation was from the Department of Defense. Yeah. So it's one of those things in college that they don't tell you, right? When you're an aerospace engineering student, you pick it because it sounds exotic and, whatever, full of adventure and interesting, but nobody tells you, at that time, all your work's going to be funded by the Department of Defense. Like, it's an interesting thing what you don't know at 23, right? When you're making these big life decisions.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. It would be quite useful to be sort of have the knowledge that you acquired over a lifetime of work when you're younger, just to sort of say, well, actually, that would be the best route.
Right. Exactly. Right. I think if I think back to that at 23, if anyone had said, when I picked that major, do you realize you're going to spend most of your life working on defense contracts? That I would have taken pause,
Yeah.
but nobody did. And I went into it because the coursework, the coursework was interesting.
Yes.
So I know it is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we fast forward to Still, the book that you've got out, and I've had a look at some of the photos. Some of the photos that you've got on Instagram are amazing. And we'll obviously talk about the book in a bit more detail. But one thing I'm curious about is that from sort of having a career that is very, very logical, I would suggest, and very scientific and mathematical, to come across to the creative element of taking photographs in nature and that part of it. I mean, some might say, "Oh, that's very different. You've got to be a different type of person." I'm not so sure that's true, but could you just elaborate on that and tell me how you see the connection, or if there is a connection between the two, please?
Yeah, it's such a common question I get, and it's a good question, and you would think I'd have a nice a patter about it, right? A nice rehearsed patter about it, and I don't. All I can say is, a couple things. I was also a creative kid, but I had to put myself through college, and so I had the pressure of having to get out of college with a job that would pay off the student loans I borrowed to go through college. And so a lot of doors were closed. I didn't get to experiment in college. I went right into engineering, stayed on that track. Had I been able to explore a little bit, I think I probably would have maybe migrated to something like architecture, which would have combined a little bit more the creative and the analytical. But yeah, I do. I think there are people that have good right brain, left brain, like more right brain, left brain connection. I don't know. I think we all do. I truly, my gut says we all do. And it just gets shut down at certain points, right? We either decide we're creative and we further develop that right brain capacities, or we decide we're analytical, or we, in my case, forced by circumstances to make practical choices. And so you kind of shut down that right brain development a little bit. I think we all have left brain, right brain capacities. And it's just a matter of when those get shut down in our development. And, but I worked in research. And so, the guys I worked with, and it was 90% guys, the guys I worked with, all PhDs, some of the most creative people I know by far, PhD engineers,
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And they all had creative hobbies. They would just decide on a whim to teach themselves how to play violin. It was that kind of thing. Yeah. And, some of them had the hobbies aligned with our field of work. They flew radio controlled airplanes or whatever in their spare time. A lot of pilots in their spare time, but a lot of them were really creative, very creative. So for me, I think besides, mathematics is an abstraction, right? Math is, and in some ways the conceptual part of art is, making something from nothing. That is a kind of abstraction that's not, in my mind, too far from mathematics.
No.
So I see them very similar. In my mind, they're very similar. I think we all have capacities for them. It's just that early on, at some point in our lives, we made choices, whether consciously or not.
No, I tend to agree with you. And there's a great historical example in Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
Who had everything really.
Right. I think we all do. I truly do that. I think everybody's creative, and it just gets shut down at some point. I mean, look at kids. I mean, there's not a single kid. You don't look at a 3-year-old and say, oh, that one's creative and that one's not. No. They're all creative. We're all creative. Yeah. And I do think we all have these left brain, right brain capacities. Yeah,
no, it's good to hear that, and reassuring for any listeners that feel that they're put in one box. So that's good stuff. I think we've spoken quite a lot about how you got into it. But could you just tell listeners a little bit about how you started? taking these photos? What inspired you to do it, and how it sort of developed, and what you got from it, please?
Yeah,
Roger.
yeah. It's actually kind of a fun story. So my husband, I mentioned, I'd worked 17 years as a in research for aerospace engineering, and then quit. My husband, I had been the primary breadwinner. We traded places. He went back to work full time, and I had kids. And at some point, and I was heads down with kids for. I find little kids very tiring, very tiring. So for the first, 4 or 5 years with little kids, I couldn't imagine adding anything further to what I was doing. But at some point, the kids, the youngest went to elementary school. And suddenly I felt like, oh, for the first time in my life, I have a couple hours a day where I could imagine adding something to my daily routine. And like I said, I'd been creative as a kid. I picked up photography in college because a college roommate was introduced me to it. And so I'd been an amateur photographer for 20 years.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So an amateur, a good amateur, but not a hardcore hobbyist,
No.
just an amateur. And, but what happened is we put our kids in French immersion school, which I'm sure you have in the UK there. It's a public school here, and we chose French because my husband's fluent in French. And my oldest daughter was coming out of the program. It was a kindergarten through 5th grade program, and she was coming out of it, and I noticed that she could understand French when spoken to her, and she could read a little bit of French, but she really wasn't speaking French. And I had driven her to this school, and I still was driving my son to the school, and it was on the other side of town. And I'd put a lot of hours I'd invested a lot of hours into these kids' education of French immersion. I wanted them to be fluent in French. So my husband and I decided to take a sabbatical. We were self-employed by then, shut down our self-employed businesses, and go live in southern France for 6 months and put the kids in school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so it was a very interesting.
Which part of southern France did you go to?
We were in the Languedoc.
Oh, yeah.
Not about 50 minutes from Montpellier.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah. And we chose it. We threw a dart at the France, and
right.
we knew, we're from Minnesota, so it's cold here.
Yeah.
It's very cold. And it was going to be a fall semester. So it was going to be August through January. And we just wanted warmth. And so we wanted to go to the south of France, and assumed we couldn't really afford anything in Provence. And so we ended up in Languedoc. And then as those things happen, it became a absolutely transformative experience. We ended up going back and forth. We've been going back and forth ever since. And my husband has a memoir coming out on July 9th about that first trip to that village. It's called A Season for That. And it's a great story about putting the kids in school and the whole thing.
Yeah.
So we're in France. I say to my husband, so it's the first time we're not working. I worked through high school. I worked through college. First time I'm not working. And I say, I was at the time reading, we're now in our mid 40s. And I say, hey, I read this book and a book about personal finance. I read this tip that you should practice for retirement. And I don't know why it stuck with me, is, of course, you can't just one day get to 65 and decide you're retired and expect you're going to know what to do the next day. You know what I mean? You've got to put the pieces in place before you get there. So it made sense to me. He had always wanted to write. I'd been this pretty good amateur photographer. I had creative desires, interests, hobbies, if you would. And so we said, let's practice for retirement. And so we did. So he started writing every morning and emailing it back to friends and family. I decided at that time that I would do one of these something a day projects. They were very popular back then. They actually still are popular because they're extremely, extremely powerful. So at the time, people were doing a collection a day or a a painting a day or a sketch a day, like a journal entry kind of sketch a day. Those were very popular. So I decided, I'll participate in this online community by, I want to participate. I'll do one of these 1-a-day projects. I'll commit to 1 year. And I looked around, I considered a bunch of things because I like to do like collage and other kinds of visual art. I considered them all, but I decided to do found nature, and I would arrange it, compose it, and make a photograph and then post it to a blog that I called Still. And we're a nature family. I had a dog I had to walk, so that I was, it all fit together. I could walk the dog, find the nature, bring it home, photograph it, post it to the blog. And so I did that, and I picked a really stylized, I just did what came natural to me, but it ended up being a very stylized presentation of the natures, very modern, very graphic, on a bright white background. And anyways, I started that and started sharing, and within about 6 months, it got a bunch of attention. And one of those flukes where one piece of attention led to another, and the next thing I knew, Martha Stewart Living, which at the time was a great big magazine here in the United States, called and said, we'd like to feature you. And so the project just kind of, within its first year, took off, and then I kept going. And I haven't missed a day for 12 years. And that's a whole different story, why I'm still doing it after 12 years. But that's how I got started. Yeah. Simultaneously, my husband started writing and sharing his work. And they got, that thing that happens where they get forwarded is little journal entries. And now he's got a book coming out in July. And my book just came out with Fiden on May 1st. And it's a crazy story. I mean, we were in the south of France for 1 6-month sabbatical and said, let's practice for retirement. And both of them led to books being published within 2 months of each other, 12 years later. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I mean, they weren't quite really supposed to pile up. That was coincidence. My husband did slip a few deadlines there
So did you have any idea that, going back 10 or 12 years, that you'd still be doing it 10 or 12 years later? The same thing.
Heck, absolutely not. No. Absolutely not. No. What happened is, I conceived of it as a 1-year project, and I wanted to teach myself elements of composition. I use a camera because that's the tool I was comfortable with. And, it got all this attention within the first year. So I felt a little bit of, responsibility to keep it going. But also what happened then within like the second year or third year is that I didn't want to stop. Something was happening. This was it wasn't turning into like a little thing I had to do every day, like brushing your teeth, like, it was turning into more like what I call a mindfulness practice. I wish I could, it's an overused term, but it was turning into something that I wanted to do every day because it enhanced my life. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I, not any different than a running habit or a yoga practice. Suddenly I realized that finding a new subject to photograph every day, that alone, period, just the treasure hunt of finding a subject that I hadn't already photographed, to photograph every day, put me in a state of alertness and attentiveness and presentness, nowness, that just was so life enhancing that it didn't make sense to me to stop. And so, like, it's not unlike any other habit, running, how good you feel after you run. I was finding that living in that state of presentness was just a delightful way to go through the day. Yes. Right. And then, so that's why I didn't stop. But then as the years added, and I kept going, I started getting this profound knowledge and these profound insights about my natural world and my place in the world and this bioregion. And so eventually more and more and more things um, presented themselves, as a result of this practice. But early on, it started as a simple creative challenge, and it turned into this mindfulness practice that was life enhancing.
Yeah.
That I had no reason to stop.
So found nature, I've heard that term before. So found nature would be something that you see and pick up along the way, as opposed to taking a photograph of it. So if there was a twig, for example, you wouldn't take a photograph of a twig on a tree. You would see the twig on the ground and take it home. Is that right?
Yeah, I that's exactly right. I photograph on my kitchen floor. It just happens to be where I have the best light in the house.
Yeah.
I've been doing this 12 years. That's over 4,500 images. It sounds crazy, but if somebody said they're a runner and they've run every day for 12 years, you wouldn't necessarily think they're crazy. But I've made 4,500 images, and so I have found, because my style was on this bright white background, my process is I find something when I'm out and I bring it home and photograph it on the kitchen floor. And so, sometimes I will go out into the field, if you will. I'm a nature lover. I don't want to, if there's one rare flower that is, a native flower that's rare, I'm not going to pick it. I'm not going to pick it to photograph it. So I'll sometimes go out in the field with my white paper and put it behind the subject and photograph it. But that's actually, for what I do, is actually quite hard because of the wind.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The wind actually, the wind plays a big factor. Given my style, what I do is I find nature that I can pick up, and it tends to be very, very ordinary stuff. And actually, the longer I went in this project, the more ordinary the subject, the more interested I got in it.
So am I right in saying then that you have never photographed anything twice? It's something of a new species or a new type of something, or do you ever repeat something?
Oh yeah, no, I will. I was misleading there, because I try to look. So I have a few followers on my blog that have been following me since the beginning of, when I started this, 2012. I try to keep it fresh for them, surprise them every day. But I have subjects that I return to just because I love them so much, and I feel like I'll keep photographing them until I've gotten to the essence of them.
Yes.
So I live in the upper Midwest. We call it the North here in North America. And so some of my favorite subjects are things like the fiddlehead ferns, milkweed, cattails. There are certain subjects that I revisit every year seasonally. And then there's the other thing is the seasonal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the fern in May is completely different than the fern in July, as is the fern in October. And then there's still fern in winter. The spore fronds still stick up through the snow in the middle of February. So I revisit them, a lot of the subjects, seasonally.
Yeah, and on that last example you gave, I guess, unless you were somebody like yourself who's actually sort of seeing them at different times of year, most people wouldn't really know about the difference there, would they?
Not at all. And that's quite frankly, I didn't 12 years ago, right? I mean, that was one of the benefits of this project, was suddenly I was acquiring, through, inspired or driven by a creative ambition, I was acquiring a profound knowledge of my bioregion, my place.
I was going to ask you that. Did the scientific part of you and the problem-solving part of you then sort of make a study of what that particular plant or object was?
Yeah, so it did come out. I became what I call citizen naturalist. And, there's this term phenology. Have you heard that? It's people who observe nature and, record their observations of the natural world. And, as a family, we were a nature family. So we were kind of already doing that a little bit, oh, look at the herons just returned to the lake. You know what I mean? The first heron of the season's here. We were already making note of that. We weren't formally doing it. But we were already kind of tuned into that kind of thing. But once I started documenting it with a daily photograph, then it's an interesting thing, 4,500 photos, right? I can remember where I was when I found most of those subjects.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's something about, and that's getting back to that mindfulness. I have to be so present when I'm finding a subject that it puts me in a different state of being where, that somehow gets more burned into memory than that sort of half presence we spend most of our life in. Suddenly I now have 4,500 data points that I can remember where I found this, what it was. When I post it, I come home, I make a photo, and then I edit it, and sometime before bedtime, I post it to the blog.
Yes.
And so in the posting, I identify it. So I do pick things I don't know, right? Yeah. I don't know what they are. They catch me because of their graphic shape. Something catches my attention. I bring them home. I photograph it. So, now I've found a subject. I've identified it. I've had to learn its name, and then I post it, and all of that's writing that into my memory.
Yeah. Two practical questions I've got, Mary Jo. One is, if you're not feeling too well, perhaps you've got a bad cold or something, do you still go out? And the second one was, if you're on holiday at a different location, do you then go to the countryside or where you are and take the objects then?
Yeah, great question. So I used to, when I started, so I'm going to go back to this running metaphor that we're using. When I started, I had a folder in the corner of my iMac that said "just in case," labeled "just in case." So it was a handful of images that I could pull if I had a day get away from me. So I use natural light. So I have a lot of times I'm chasing the light. I'm running. It's 7:00 in the evening in the summertime, or 4:00 in the evening in the wintertime, and I'm running out of light. And so I put a little folder. It was called "Just in Case." Well, I haven't had that folder now for years on my thing. I found it was easier to just make a photo every day than to stop and start. And it's just like a runner. If you're a runner, it's just easier to just run a little bit every day than it is to do 6 miles on Saturday, So it's very, very similar. I just found, you can make all the excuses in the world, but it's just easier. The thing, so I talk about the power of this dailiness, and when I give workshops and stuff, what I mention to people is that when you do it, you're committing to the process. You're committing to not breaking the chain, okay? And the results you don't worry about, and they will come. It's just guaranteed they'll come. It's based on a story of Jerry Seinfeld. A young comedian came up to him at a show and said, "What's your advice for a young comedian just getting started?" And Jerry Seinfeld said, "Get yourself one of these big wall calendars, and every day write down one joke, and put an X on the calendar when you write down one joke, and never break the chain." And so that's what I've been doing. I learned that Jerry Seinfeld story 5 years ago. I'd already been into my project for 5 or 6 years, but it's exactly what I've done. I've not broken the chain. And I found it's easier to not break the chain than to, fits and starts.
No, I play the guitar. I play the guitar, and I was asked by somebody at a gig saying, "Oh, I expect you have to practice every day, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "So you're motivated every day to do it?" He said. I said, "No, not really." I said, "But sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. But it's that sheer element of just getting on it, even if it's a half an hour, 10 minutes or a half an hour. At least you do it. Once you're involved with it, it's easier."
Yeah. So it's the exact same thing. You understand 100%. It's easier just to do it. And even so for me, the reason I've not broken the chain for 12 and a half years is that the minimum, like you're talking about, even if it's 5-10 minutes of guitar practice, the minimum for me is, which I almost did yesterday, which is interesting, is I can run outside and grab a handful of whatever's out there, grass in the front yard or, whatever's there, and put it on white paper and photograph it. And I'll post it and, with a little explanation that the day got away from me and this is all I had time for. But, the minimum to not break the chain is small. Yeah. So there's no reason to break the chain. No. And just like your guitar, there are days you don't want to do it, but you pick it up and you just work, your chords for 5 or 10 minutes. And what I've learned often too, this is the power of this dailiness, is that some of those dashed off compositions that I do as the sun is setting and I don't have an idea and I don't even particularly into it, but I go outside, I find something, I make a photo. Some of those turn out to be some of my better photos. There is something about shutting down that intellectual, right?
Yes.
And you're just chasing the deadline.
Yeah.
That ends up being really some of my better photos. So I'm a huge believer in not breaking the chain.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So notwithstanding the wonders of the art that you're producing and the lovely photos, is the fact that you've got this mindfulness thing going. And I guess, has the whole thing changed you as a person, do you think?
Yes. Can we go back to that? Do I do it on travel?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Yeah.
And then we'll come back to that. Yeah. No, I forgot, because I wanted, the other thing about this practice, is that I do it on travel. And what I found is, cause I don't know it, like, I feel like I want something to share with your listeners, but what I have found is, now that we do this, I do this, and the whole family participates now, because it's kind of like a treasure hunt. What's mom going to photograph today? But it's been a shortcut to integration everywhere we've gone. And because in order to, when we go somewhere we've never been and we find, so I'm from the north, like if I go to a coastal or say a desert location, say I go to Palm Springs in the United States, I don't know the names of things, right? I don't know a Palo Verde tree from whatever. I can't even think of another example. So if I find something, I've got to start asking people, what is this, right? And suddenly I'm no longer just a tourist, right? I'm somebody who's interested enough in their place to learn the names of their geography. Yeah. And it has opened so many doors for us as travelers to be this simple little project. So it's an interesting thing. It changes us very quickly from tourists to sort of like curious new residents in a way. And that's been very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think people could think about as they go on vacation. So back to your question, what was the new question? I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. What I was saying was, notwithstanding the beauty of the art that you're producing and everything else, how do you think the whole process of going out every day and, taking an object and learning something about it, how do you think that, and the mindfulness bit in particular, how do you think that's changed you? Or has it changed you, I guess?
Good. Yes, for sure. It has. Matter of fact, I just gave a lecture for the first time. I was very, very nervous for the organization in the United States called 92nd Street Y. It's a New York cultural center. And I called it Life as a Total Work of Art. And it was my thought process after having done this 12-year practice of what I learned about living a fully integrated creative life. And I do feel like I say stumble because I do feel like in the same way that I stumbled into engineering, I stumbled into this practice that has been incredibly profound. When I say that in workshops, people say, "Oh, it wasn't accidental. You didn't stumble. It was intuitive wisdom." I don't know. It doesn't matter. That's just semantics. I feel like I stumbled into a practice of where it's what I call a total work of art. It's an oeuvre d'art total. I'm borrowing it from, it has European traditions, actually started in Germany. And it's where the art feeds the life and the life feeds the art. So, the walks are the exercise, but the walks provide me the opportunity to find the subjects to photograph, and one thing builds on the other, builds on the other. So it's, I feel like this project, and I didn't have that wisdom when I started, right? I just decided to do a 1-a-day project. And because I had a little free time, and I used a camera and nature because, that made sense at the time. But now here I am 12 and a half years later, and I feel like, and part of the reason I haven't quit is that these things probably did have some intuitive wisdom, but this feels like a fully integrated creative life that is where one element of the life feeds other elements of the life. And so, you don't have to have, I don't have to go to the gym for an hour and then, practice my art for an hour. And, where the siloed things we've kind of done in our society, I've found a way to integrate them into what I call one total work of art. And I found that it's a very, very, very satisfying way to live. So, the practicing the art becomes the exercise, is the physical activity. Yeah.
Yeah. So it certainly sounds it. What advice would you give somebody who, well, two questions really, feels inspired to do something every day that could possibly lead to something, but they want to do it for the enjoyment and the process of it. And the second question was, do you know of anybody, or if we've got any listeners who fancy doing something exactly the same as you, but perhaps in a different location? What would you say to those questions?
Yeah, the latter is fast and easy. There are people doing exactly what I'm doing. I have early on, people came across it, and I encouraged them and said, "Oh, wouldn't it be interesting if people were documenting their bioregion with the same level of attention as I am all over the world?" And so there actually are people doing that. And so that happened naturally. Back to your question about advice for people, and it's a great question. And I would say, I think if you have creative ambitions, and I think a lot of us do, and I would say try one of these 1-a-day challenges. There are 30-day challenges, 90 or 100-day challenges in a year. I think 30 is too short. I would say give yourself a minimum of a 100-day challenge, and, set it up so that the minimum to not break the chain is very, very simple. So and then commit to not breaking the chain, and don't worry at all about the art you're making. See, the power of the process is that it shuts down that perfectionism.
Yes.
So you're focusing on the process. You're focusing on not breaking the chain, and the art gets made almost, without you're even being aware of it. So if, the process works on multiple, it lowers the stakes, it shuts down autopilot, it turns off perfectionism. It works for multiple reasons. So I would say do one of these 100-day challenges and just commit to not breaking the chain. And just my point I said earlier, don't overcomplicate it. Keep it simple. The commitment is, just don't break the chain. And for the days that get away from you, because life happens, it will happen, it does happen. The minimum to not break the chain is maybe pick up the guitar and strum a few chords, 3 chords or something. That's it.
Yeah.
Or dip a paintbrush in some water and put a blotch on a piece of paper, and you've made your painting for the day.
Yeah.
And I would say it was powerful. And if another thing is you go ahead into retirement, and if you say you pick up what you decide to do 100-day watercolor challenge, and at the end of 100 days, you're not feeling it. Give yourself permission to try something else, pick up the guitar, right. And try that.
Yeah.
But these 100-day challenges, they really do work. And so I would say, give them a shot. They sound so simple and almost simplistic, but they're very, very, very powerful.
Yeah, no, certainly. That sounds really good. So have you got any more projects in the offing at all, Mary Jo? Or are you busy enough doing your photos?
Well, I'm doing my photos. I'm still doing my practice, and I plan to do it. It's like a running practice at this point. I think I might go start photographing on black here pretty soon instead of the white.
Yeah.
Just to change it up. And but my book came out May 1st, and my husband's book comes out July 9th. And so do you have a book? Have you ever done a book, Bob?
Yeah, I do intend to write a book at some point, definitely. Yeah.
Excellent. Have you ever done the morning pages?
Yeah, the one I do is 750words.com, which is it's essentially 700. It is morning pages. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, my that's fantastic. I love it. My advice to you is do it even on travel, but give yourself the permission to just do 150 words or something.
Oh, okay.
That you're not stopping and starting when you travel.
Yeah.
But anyway, you asked what I'm going to do next. So I've got a book out. My husband's got a book coming out. It's marketing books these days. It's like a full-time job.
Yes. You've got to do it yourself, haven't you now?
You got to do it yourself, and that's the new rules of the game. And it's been far busier with the book launch activities than I thought. My book, knock on wood, is done phenomenally well. Surprise even the publisher on how well it's doing.
Oh, fantastic.
And So, but it's been busy. I mean, giving talks and lectures and workshops and press interviews. So that's what I'm doing right now.
So on the lectures that you do you sort of talk about the, shall we say, the more heavy underlying part of what you've learned from it and the mindfulness part of it, like we've done today? Do you talk about that?
Yeah, I talk about. So it depends on the audience. So one thing we didn't even talk about today is because unfortunately I didn't have time to get you a copy of the book. One of the big insights from this, doing this for 12 years, and this whole idea of becoming intimate with a place and having this nuanced and detailed knowledge of a bioregion or an ecosystem. One of the things that came out of it was this whole concept called 72 microseasons.
Yes.
And I, in the book, I do a 72 microseasonal calendar of my place, with words and photos. So, I mean, that's, to be able to say in your 72 microseasons are 5-day increments. So to know your place well enough to know what the 5-day seasonal.
What? So there will
seasons,
be, so within the seasons, there'll be noticeable variances and differences in sort of 5 days or whatever.
Yeah. So It's based on a ancient Japanese calendar that they lived by for like 500 years during the Heian period. And Japan's at the 45th parallel. So are we. So it's surprisingly interesting. It wouldn't even be interesting to do this at the equator, right? And we're continental here in North America. And so we're smack in the middle of the North American continent. So we have extreme seasonal variation.
Yeah.
But I was able to say, this happens for 5 days, then this, and one thing begets another. And that was a level, of knowledge, quite frankly, that we lived by, ancient civilizations lived by until probably the Industrial Revolution, right? And I think, and then with the information age, we got very, very distant from that kind of knowledge. We know when I teach workshops to little kids, they don't even know the names of things anymore. I mean, it's kind of heartbreaking, right? Their knowledge is a different knowledge, but it's not a knowledge of place at all or seasons. So anyways, that 72 microseasons was one of the things that came out of one of the profound learnings in this 12-year process. So when I talk, back to your question, sometimes I'm talking to gardeners, sometimes I'm talking to creatives who want to talk about this dailiness practice. Sometimes I'm talking to just like the 92nd Street Y, which is just lifelong learners, people just curious, people that are curious people that like learning new things. So it depends on the audience. Yeah. And I'm able to tailor what I do. I can talk for 4 hours on the creative process, or I can talk for 4 hours on the 72 microseasons,
As you are aware of all these microseasons, and particularly in your area, and you've been doing it for 12 years, have you noticed any change in the climate and in terms of what comes when? Is there any evidence of climate change?
So, yeah, I get asked that. And so I have been detailed documenting my bioregion for the last 12 and a half years. Yes and no. So the answer is yes and no, for sure. Like last year, I'm in Minnesota. It's the north here. We had almost no snow last winter. It's unheard of. And our entire ecosystem is dependent on that blanket of snow. The critters all live under that blanket of snow to protect them from the wind all winter. So, that blanket of snow is necessary. So in last year we got no snow. So everybody, all those critters are exposed to wet, cold wind all winter. Anyway, so on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. And I'll say so I would be reluctant. I would not stand up to make a definitive statement. And the reason is because we're continental, because I'm in the smack in the middle of the North American continent. Our weather here is, and always has been, super highly variable.
Yeah.
So, and you with your maritime climates, it's more predictable, right? And that the oceans act like big dampers, right? Yeah. And they absorb heat, and and so it dampens your weather, your highs and lows. But as weather moves across the North American continent, typically from the west to the east, or pushing up from the Gulf of Mexico, it as it moves across land, it gets more and more. It picks up, instead of being dampened, it gets the opposite. It tends to get more and more full of energy, the weather systems. And so we've always had highly variable weather. So when you take a very noisy system and then try to pick out a small signal in it, it's tricky.
No, I understand. So, yeah. No, I understand.
Yeah.
Where can people find out more about your work and your book, Mary Jo?
My book is called Still the Art of Noticing, and it is by Mary Jo Hoffman. It's published by Phaidon, a nice UK company. And so it's available worldwide, absolutely everywhere books are sold and online. Okay. So Still the Art of Noticing. I'm Mary Jo Hoffman on Instagram. It's the really only place I'm active on social media. And the blog is called Still blog. If you type in Mary Jo Hoffman and Still, you'll find all those things right away. Because 12 and a half years of daily posts puts me at the top of this, SEO. So. Oh,
excellent. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll put it all in the show notes. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, Mary Jo. It's especially inspiring on how a daily practice can provide so much more and open up a whole range of unforeseen benefits that you might otherwise have not discovered. My guest today has been Mary Jo Hoffman. Mary Jo is author of the book Still, which shares a selection of 275 stunning photographs that she's taken of natural objects and is accompanied by essays illuminating insights that she's gained by this daily practice. Thank you for coming on the show, Mary Jo.
Thank you. This has been delightful. I really enjoyed this conversation.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.